Welcome back to the Prepared School Psych podcast. I'm very excited for today's conversation because we're joined by someone whose work has truly shaped how we think about executive functioning in schools. Dr. Peg Dawson is a nationally respected school psychologist and co-author of the Smart but Scattered series, a go-to resource for educators, parents, and clinicians working to support students with executive skill challenges. With over 4 decades of experience, Dr. Dawson has worked across school, clinical, and training settings, served in leadership roles with both the national and international school psychology associations, and received the NASP Lifetime Achievement Award for her contributions to the field. Her work is known for blending research and real-world application in a way that is both clear and deeply impactful. Dr. Dawson, we're so honored to have you with us today. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, we always like to ask our guests, what is a favorite TV show that you are watching right now?
An interesting way to start a podcast. Okay, so I'm down to the last episode of a miniseries called Drops of Gold, which is available on Apple TV, and it features a wine contest between two people who are internationally recognized experts on wine. It's just incredibly well done. It takes place in both France and Japan, and since I have a son who lives in Japan, that's sort of what drew me to it. But I'd recommend it to anybody. It's really, really well done.
Awesome. Well, and that's why we kick off the podcast with that question, because everyone's always wondering with all these streaming services, what are the things that people are watching? So
Yeah,
I'm
thanks.
going to definitely have to check that one out. You said some of my favorite things, including wine. So I'm excited about looking into that one. Well, in about one sentence, how would your colleagues have described you in your so very many roles that you play?
So, I've been in this field for so long that I've gone through several iterations, starting out as a school psychologist working in the public schools to working in a clinic setting to developing sort of an expertise in assessment and attention disorders. But I think probably for the last 20 years or so, I'm most well known for my work in executive skills. So I think that's how they would describe me now, as an expert in executive skills.
Well, when exactly did you start your school psychology journey? And at what point did you become really interested in this executive functioning piece that you are now so well known for?
Okay, so it depends on how far back you want to go. When I was growing up, I wanted to be a teacher. And when I was in high school, I decided I wanted to be a French teacher. And then I spent my senior year of high school as an exchange student in Norway, and I became fluent in Norwegian. But I also realized over the course of the year, if you really want to learn a foreign language, you should just go to that country and learn the language that way. So suddenly I was no longer a French teacher. So then I was sort of struggling for what else I might look to as a career. My friends and I, and this is way back in the 60s, where the only communication was snail mail. We were writing letters to each other, and they were dealing with some stuff at home. I was suggesting ways they might solve it. And I thought, oh, psychology. That's what this is. This is psychology. So I went to college as a psych major, and my sophomore year in college, I remember wandering around the stacks in the library where I went to it, and I ran across a book called Psychology in the Schools, which is a classic book by Susan Gray that only people from my generation would know about. But I looked at that title, and I thought, oh, you can do psychology in the schools? How cool is that? So that's what led me to school psychology. And I got my doctorate from the University of Virginia. I did a pre-doctoral internship on Huntington, Long Island, but I'm from New England originally, and I knew I wanted to go back to New England. And so moved originally to Maine and then ultimately to New Hampshire. Working in and around public schools, I started working for a community mental health center that had a school consultation department in Maine. That was the way school psych services were provided in those days. When I moved to New Hampshire, I got a job in an agency that was really, their board of directors were the superintendents of schools for several school districts, and they were providing a variety of support services in the schools, including school psychology. Then I moved into a public school setting and worked in 2 different public school settings before connecting with ultimately my colleague and my co-author, Dr. Guare, He also went to UVA, and we were introduced to each other by a mutual professor that we'd had. And he kept saying, "You guys are both in New Hampshire. You really should know each other." So he got a postdoc in neuropsychology and was doing neuropsych assessments, and he needed someone to help him out with that. So that's how we connected initially. Then I left the public schools and just started doing assessments, assessing a lot of kids referred for attention disorders. And that's how I got to executive skills. Because I remember in the early stages, I mean, Dick was my supervisor at that point, and so I was giving him all my reports, and he was, critiquing them and making suggested changes. But I remember saying to him, "So I know what ADHD is, problems with attention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, but I've got a bunch of kids with problems with other things like planning and time management and organization." And he said, "Well, Peck, those are executive skills," which was not a widely recognized term in those days, but we just kept seeing how they permeated the kids that we were seeing in terms of what was really impacting school performance. It was executive skills more than anything else, whether it was a learning disability or an attention disorder. So that's how we decided we really wanted to zero in and understand the field better. And I have to admit, at the same time, I have two kids of my own. My older son, around that same time, was diagnosed with an attention disorder. So I was learning about this stuff professionally and applying it in helping my own kid get through high school. So that's what got me there.
Awesome. Well, as you know, collaboration with teachers and parents is crucial. What advice do you have for educators on effectively communicating the importance of executive skills to partner parents, teachers, and staff?
So the easiest way to connect is to let both parents and teachers know that executive skills are better predictors of school success than anything else, than school achievement, than IQ, than SES. And then you say, this is why, because executive skills are the infrastructure that support academic performance. And once they understand that, then suddenly they're not trying to focus on executive skills as being, oh, that's just one more thing I need to do. I really need to be teaching kids academic skills. And we say, no, this is the way you teach academic skills. These are skills. In fact, my favorite definition for executive skills was shared with me by a second grade teacher who took a class I taught for several years at the University of Southern Maine. And she was trying to figure out, how do I explain executive skills to second graders? And what she came up with was they're the skills you need to get things done. And so once you understand that and understand getting things done is all about learning in school, then it's not a hard sell. I mean, the next question always is, well, how can I do that
Mhm.
in a way that is effective and it doesn't make me feel like I'm torn in 100 different directions? That's another conversation. But
Well, given the increasing demand on students, are there any specific executive skills that you believe are becoming particularly critical for navigating our 21st century learning environment?
so interesting question. I mean, of course, I would say, these are my babies. They're all important. But one of the things that I do sometimes in my work with schools is I will ask teachers to give me the top 3 executive skill challenges that kids at their grade level are dealing with. And every once in a while, I have the good fortune of being able to survey an entire school, usually private schools because they're smaller, they're K through 12. And then I break down the results by lower elementary, upper elementary, middle school, high school. And in the last year or so, there's one executive skill that occurs in every single one of those age groups, and it's sustained attention.
Mm,
And, I think of that as a foundational skill. And it is a foundational skill
yeah.
because kids do start developing that skill early. But the society we live in now it makes it so hard to sustain attention to anything. And so that's probably the skill I would focus on.
Well, and I love the definition that you have in your books about sustained attention because so many of us sit in meetings with parents and teachers and we talk about attention, and the parent will say they can pay attention for 4 hours playing video games. So I love the definition that you guys utilize, which is it's not just sustaining attention in your most favorite activity, it's despite fatigue and boredom and
Yeah.
distractibility. What have you found with those different age groups? Is it a similar strategy idea for first graders who struggle and 11th graders who struggle? Or do you find that those sustained attention strategies need to be a little bit more individualized for those grade levels?
So here's what they have in common is that you have to teach it explicitly.
Mm,
I mean, in the old days, we used to be able to say, okay, class, pay attention, and kids would stop and look at you. And now it's like you have to talk to kids about why paying attention is important and how you pay attention and you practice paying attention. And that may look different at different age levels, but more often than not, is what is paying attention? Paying attention is eyes on teacher. Paying attention is listening to the lesson. Paying attention is following along in your reading. So we basically separate it out into what are the behavioral descriptors of attention? And
mhm,
those may look different at different age levels, but there's some commonalities in there. And then we start helping kids self-monitor. How are
mhm.
you doing at paying attention? We help them keep track of how well they're paying attention. We give them feedback about how well they're paying attention. But all of that's I mean, that's basically, those are the principles, across grade levels.
Okay. Well, what are your thoughts? Speaking of sustained attention, we're going to bring up technology. What are your thoughts on the role of technology and digital tools in either supporting or hindering our executive skill development in students?
Yeah, good question. And I mean, the easy answer is it's complicated. And in fact, when we just revised our Smart but Scattered, the original book, and we added a chapter on technology, and we really wrestled with how to handle that. And because the whole domain is changing so rapidly that
Mm,
to just write, even 2 years ago, we wouldn't have been talking about how to handle artificial intelligence. And yet now, it's pervasive in terms of how to help kids navigate that field or how to help schools navigate that field. So I guess, very often, especially when I do parent workshops, people want me to say technology is bad. You know, we need to figure out ways to keep kids away from technology. And I do think that is an issue, but technology is a double-edged sword. That's point number one. Point number two, we can't put the genie back in the bottle. I mean, we have to recognize that technology is here to stay. And it's how do we use it? How do we as parents or teachers help shape our kids' use of technology? And two, are there some reasonable principles in terms of how we think about technology? I am completely on board with getting smartphones out of the classroom. And I know there are arguments for why most of them are not good arguments. It's just way too distracting.
mm,
And I think the broader principle there is we are handing kids at a pretty early age, like most kids get smartphones sometime during middle school, at an age where they do not have the response inhibition skills to make good decisions about how to use smartphones or when to use smartphones. And so I think we need to acknowledge that, recognize it, and we need at that age. I mean, when kids are in high school, then I mean, it makes sense to talk with kids at every point. How much time are you spending on phones? How are you making decisions about that? But I think through the end of middle school, at a minimum, we need to be saying, no, sorry, during school, smartphones are off limits. At the high school level, I still recommend it there, but there we also need to be having conversations with kids about how are you spending your spare time?
mhm.
So, how are you using phones at home or other technology? But it just seems like nowadays it's phones that are the biggest distractor. I mean, I know and it's interesting because I know there are also concerns about kids using laptops in the classroom. I've talked with teachers or even schools that have said, we've moved back to pencil and paper. We are not because there are just too many distractions if we have people on laptops. And I mean, that's really interesting. And I think it makes sense. So I recognize there are distractions associated with laptops as well. But I think the biggest distractor outside of school that probably interferes with kids spending good time doing quality homework or quality reading for that matter is they're on their phones. And so helping them think about how and when and how much they're using their phones is a good conversation to have.
Well, and I see this a lot with adults. I get to do a lot of trainings with adults. And a lot of times, whether it's an in person training or not, I like to share resources. So a lot of times I'll ask them to have their laptops open. And I know I'm opening up this entire world of distraction. And so a lot of times we have to have a conversation of this really isn't the best time for you to be checking your email. And wouldn't it be great if you just didn't get to check email for a couple of hours? Because I think all the adults on campus are also very addicted to those
Yeah.
buzzes and beeps and, oh my gosh, I just got a new email. And I was just sharing with someone recently, like our brain needs to see, like, what is that buzz about? But at the same time, like, no one's ever gotten an email that said, we just hired 5 new people to help support you. Or all of these referrals, someone else to, like, none of the information that are popping up on our emails are really good news. Most of the time, it's like, we just got 5 new referrals. It's the end of the school year. Good luck with
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
Yet
Yeah.
our brain is just so trained to, oh my gosh, I heard something. I have to figure out what that is.
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, I agree. And yeah, I know. I mean, there are times when I mention it in workshops. There are times actually when other people invite me to do workshops that they mention it. Okay, staff, now is not the time to be on your, and I'm happy with that because that doesn't make me the bad guy. It makes the supervisor, and that's their role anyway. So
Exactly.
yeah, it's an issue.
Well, what are some common pitfalls or misunderstanding that you've observed when schools are attempting to implement different interventions for our executive skills? And how can educators help avoid some of these pitfalls?
Well, this is the biggest challenge, and I haven't solved this challenge. Once teachers start understanding executive skills, then they use that knowledge to help kids navigate whatever they have to do, but they're not necessarily helping kids make the connection
Mm.
between whatever they're asking to do and whatever executive skill they're practicing. I mean, in a lot of my workshops, I start with, so where do you think these skills come from? And I poll people and I say, here are 4 ways that human infants acquire skills. Just naturally over time, according to some internal timetable, the way vision is developed in infants through practice, through modeling and shaping, or through explicit instruction. And they say, all 4 of these have some role in executive skill development, which is the biggest one. And modeling and shaping almost always comes up as that's the one people are voting for. And then I say, I think that's probably true, but I think we could be doing modeling and shaping better. We could be making it explicit because right now it's all implicit.
Mm.
We lay out the plan for doing a long-term project without telling kids, okay, here's how you construct a plan for doing a long-term project. And guess what? Planning is a skill you're going to need after you've handed in your last long-term project of your school career.
Yeah.
So that's the piece, and maybe I'm slightly changing the question, but that's the piece I wish everybody were doing more of, was labeling the skill as it's being used in real time, point of performance, as Russ Barkley would say. Because if we can make that connection, then kids will start making that connection. So that's what I'd like to see happening.
Well, I think it's interesting too. So many of the schools that I work with, we continue to talk about the impact of, whether it was a couple of months or a year or so of the COVID related building closures. And I don't think we realized how explicit our teaching was of these different skills, how much our schools reinforce these skills until we sent everyone home and we're like, good luck figuring this all out on your own. By the way, you have to log into Zoom at these 5 different times during the day.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
again, not always A, giving the strategies, or B, hey guys, we're all going to be working on this executive skill during this shutdown and being able, like you said, to name that. And I feel
Yeah.
like a lot of our students are still trying to make up for those, again, months, years for some of our students away from that very explicit teaching.
Yeah, and actually, it doesn't even have to be explicit, but still, there are supports in place for kids that gradually we scaffold them. And so we gradually reduce them. And the metaphor I ended up using to help people understand the impact of the pandemic was I talked about a ladder, and each rung on the ladder is a separate grade. So rung 1 is first grade, 2, second grade, third grade. So 2 years disrupted. That remove those 2 rungs of the ladder. That means we're going from first grade to 4th grade without that gradual building. So that's point number 1 around the pandemic. Point number 2 around the pandemic, and this I think was more visible in terms of its negative impact at the middle school and high school level, because we were struggling with how do you teach kids remotely. We were much looser about our expectations, and we were also putting more on kids, but they weren't teaching them about time management or whatever. And so what happened was we allowed kids to grow bad habits. And
Mhm.
they spend 2 years growing bad habits, and that's hard to change. Procrastination is a habit. Once you've built in this, "Oh, I don't have to do this today, it's not due till Friday," and you haven't learned how to manage time, then you've had 2 years of practicing procrastination that you then have to undo. So, yeah, and there was a huge impact of the pandemic, and I think we're understanding that a little, but I still feel like everybody's impatient and saying, "That's in the rearview mirror. Why are we still looking at" I mean, really, is there any fallout from the pandemic? Yeah, there is. And at all ages. I mean, I ran across an article in the past year or so that talked about children who were infants during the pandemic,
Mhm.
and they could even see effects on their later development. So no age was spared from infancy to college.
I love the latter analogy. I
Yeah.
think that can be a very useful one when we think about, yeah, we had a lot of, again, those middle school and high school students who came on back, who did their freshman year online, and then all of a sudden came on back. There was this expectation, I think, just in this analogy, that all of our teachers as sophomores were like, why don't they have sophomore level skills in all of these different pieces? Well, we took away that rung. I
Yeah.
love that analogy.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes sense to me too.
Hey everyone, Jenny Ponzuric here with a quick video I hope you find useful. As you were thinking about ways to provide support to your staff next year, I wanted to share a resource that may be useful. As you know, executive functioning skills are a hot topic in special education. Some of you may have had me come to your district to present on this topic, which is one of my favorite. And I likely shared some resources to support the students at your schools who struggle with time management, organization, etc. But what about the educators at your schools who struggle with these same skills? The special education assessment team member who struggles to get the report completed on time, or the teacher who struggles to prioritize. Do they respond to parent emails first and then work on the IEPs, or should the lesson plans be first? From teachers to SLPs to school psychs, and maybe even you, when an adult struggles with these skills, it can have an impact. This is why this summer I am launching the Executive Functioning Academy Educator Edition. Yes, we are going to be providing tips, strategies, and supports for the adults who work in education, who they themselves have executive skill challenges. Click on the link near this video to find out all of the details. We will have a summer cohort and a fall cohort. Registration is open for both of them. And as always, if you have any questions, hit reply to this email or send me a DM. I am happy to answer them. Until next time, have a great rest of your day. Well, speaking of like next steps, what are some of the most promising areas of research in executive skills that you believe will have some implications for education in the coming years?
Yeah. I mean, first, I need to just quibble about research. As a practitioner,
Yes.
I'm hoping we're changing the way we think about executive skills because for the longest time, hardcore researchers of executive skills have boiled them down to 3 skills. Working memory, flexibility, and response inhibition, however you call it. Those are our terms for it. But those are the 3. And so they try to understand how kids are doing in school just based on those 3 skills. And those, if you have to unpack those 3 skills, they are huge. In fact, Adele Diamond did it. I sometimes use it in one of my presentations where she takes those 3 skills and then breaks them down into subcomponents and draws arrows. I mean, it's very complicated. I think we need to get away from that. I had a teacher who asked me to be on her dissertation committee. She was doing her dissertation in the area of executive skills, did some really cool stuff around youth action research. It was qualitative, involving kids. But when she first was developing her proposal, she was just looking at those 3 skills. And I said to her, Rachel, use ours because that translates into what we see in the classroom. And each of our skills, and admittedly, if you do factor analysis on our 11 skills, there are not 11 skills. I mean, we've done it. There are like 5. But nonetheless, the terms make sense. And especially since we generated them out of what do kids need to be successful in the classroom. So that's what she did. And what she found was that once she switched her language, Now she could see what skills kids were developing. I mean, she had them carrying out a project that involved collecting data and interviewing teachers, et cetera. Then she, at the end of her dissertation, she realized, oh, these kids really developed good planning skills. Well, where is planning and working memory response inhibition and the flexibility where? So that's what I would like to see, is people much more using real life terminology and more discrete skills rather than trying to pack everything into, those three categories. A place where I do think we're getting better, but there's still more work to be done, is a lot of the research on executive skills used laboratory tasks, like
Mm.
subtests off the NEPSI or the Wisconsin College Sort or stuff like that. And that too, there's a leap between understanding how a kid does the Ray-Ostheryth complex figure. That's one of my favorite ones to use. No, it's considered a measure of planning and organization. But how does that relate to doing a long-term project?
Mhm.
Right? I mean, so too often we've used these laboratory tasks and tried to generalize to the classroom. And then we make assumptions about how, well, it turns out those laboratory tasks really aren't predicting school performance. Yeah, because they're also not particularly descriptive of executive skills. So we've gotten better about that. And I mean, that's the divide, right, between research and practice all the time, is that in order to design controlled research studies, they start looking less and less like the real world. And then we try to extrapolate and say, well, because they did this, and that must mean in school, this is what we need to be paying attention to. I remember years ago, I won't name names, probably because I can't remember her name, but I went to a symposium at NASP where they were talking about executive skills, and this hardcore researcher whose real background is academic achievement, curriculum-based measurement. She does some really good stuff in that area, but she just stood up and she said, I think executive skills should be relegated to cocktail party conversations because they are useless in terms of thinking what's going on in school. Yeah, I had that reaction too. And Matt Burns, if you know Matt Burns, he was leading the symposium. And when he asked for questions, I raised my hand. He was saying, oh, not Peg, please, Peg, not. And I made the point that when we're talking about executive skills, we're talking about observable behaviors. And no psychologist in their right mind would say, oh, no, that's off the table. We're only going to look at words read correctly per minute. Come on. If you can't start reading or you can't stick with it long enough to get it done because you get bored or distracted, isn't that important to school achievement? So,
I think so. And, as a school neuropsychologist, a lot of times I love giving subtests from the NEPSI and the DCAF. So I get and do a lot of trainings on this topic as well. And there's so many times that we are giving tests like that. And like you said, we're trying to generalize that to the classroom setting. I remember very specifically being asked, it was a very unique kind of assessment that I was doing in the schools, but they were saying, like, this is a student who has both autism and ADHD diagnoses, and we'd love for you to do a deep dive into his executive skills. And I remember doing a lot of one on one testing with this student. And he actually, in that beautiful, quiet one on one setting where I tell him when to start, when I tell him to stop, we get to practice, like, he showed beautiful performance on those tools. But when I looked at the rating scales in both the home and the school setting, they were elevated across everywhere.
yeah.
And there was such a disconnect in our conversation. And I was like, he seems in a very isolated manner to have some of these skills, but he doesn't know when to use any of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely none of them in the classroom setting. So it was such an interesting, because rarely am I asked to like only look at one type of skill for a
Oh, yeah.
student.
That is interesting. Yeah.
And it
So,
was just night and day in from like everyone around the IEP table was like, what do you mean he could do all those tasks? And I was like, but again, we're in this really quiet room and I see that he's fatiguing, so I'm going to give him a break. School
yeah.
doesn't give kids our breaks
Yeah. Yeah.
just because the kid looks a little fatigued that day.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I did assessment for years and enjoyed doing it. I mean, I totally distrusted all the subtest scores. I thought of doing assessment as a way to do a structured clinical observation about the kid's behavior. And I learned how to look for executive skill challenge. In fact, we created a test observation form that's in one of our books that really describes the test behaviors you might see that would lead you to think, oh, this kid has problems with response inhibition.
Mm.
Answering the question before you finish asking it, grabbing for the materials before you finish putting them out, or just after you said, don't touch anything. I mean, there's so much you can pick up, but the test scores themselves, because again, there's scaffolding involved there, right? We're providing this. In fact, I have a whole slide where I say, in a testing situation, I'm telling a kid when to start. So how do I measure task initiation? Most of the tasks I give kids don't take more than 3 minutes. How can I measure sustained attention? And I go through, a bunch of different things that are common to standardized testing. But I ultimately conclude that, kids are more doers than they are talkers. So there's a value to doing that kind of testing. It's just that you really have to look at the behavior rating scales for sure, because that's going to give you a much more accurate picture. And it is helpful, I think, in the case that you just described, to be able to describe to teachers under these controlled circumstances, this kid can access those skills,
Mhm.
given a level of support that's just we don't provide and maybe shouldn't provide in the classroom. So,
Well, not in a general education classroom with 29 other students.
right,
I
right.
can't
Who
imagine
could do
ever
that?
suggesting anyone could do that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked a little bit about your books. We often discuss your Smart But Scattered series within our Prepared School Psych community. We actually held a book club in January with your second edition.
Oh,
In
cool.
addition to those resources, what additional resources, books or articles or websites would you recommend for educators who are looking to really deepen their understanding and expertise in this topic?
Sure. Well, one of the people I really like is a researcher at the University of Toronto named Lori Faith. She has a website called activatedlearning.com with a lot of teacher generated materials. You get a feel for how she approaches executive skills. She also has written, I mean, I'm the third author, but I didn't do anything, executive function skills in the classroom, especially for classroom teachers or for those who work with classroom teachers in the K-8 grade levels. I highly recommend this book. On our website, which is smartbutscatteredkids.com, she wrote a brief article describing how you can use this book as part of a book club. So that would be my number one recommendation. And again, her website is really helpful as well. Other than that, I think there are useful resources out there. I think Sarah Ward's work, if you're
Mhm.
familiar with Sarah Ward, she has a lot of really good strategies for executive skills. She's a speech path by training, but she's also written books, but does a lot of professional development. I think the distinction people often ask me, because I've worked in places where people have gone to her trainings compared to mine or brought her in as well as me to presentations. I think the difference is she's more strategy focused and I'm more process focused. I'm more, let's look at how we're approaching executive skills. How are we helping teachers figure out how to integrate or weave executive skills into the classroom that doesn't necessarily mean we're teaching get ready, do, done, which is her probably best known strategy. And again, she has great strategies, but I think there's another piece. And actually, I think Lori Faith does that as well. She is great at talking about how do you hold classroom conversations in a way that helps kids and teachers converse about executive skills, think about strategies that will work in this particular setting. And it's tailored to the individual teacher, the individual classroom, the individual kid. And so that's the piece that I think gets lost a little in Sarah's work. But, people are highly complimentary of her. And she just sent me a book, which she wrote on a 3-volume set on time management, which breaks time management down into every tiny piece you could imagine. And it's great. And I could see using that as a resource. If you got kids, you got to figure out how to help them understand time better. So, yeah, I think that those are the two. Do you have others that you rely on?
I always send people to the Smart But Scattered website,
Yeah.
absolutely. And for me, when I first encountered your books, I purposely read the books that were more geared towards parents because I knew that the language in there would be very
Yes.
friendly.
Yes.
And so when I was first walking through my first experiences with this really large topic, I found the original Smart But Scattered book to be very useful. And then when I moved to the executive skills in children and adolescents, which I always tell people is like more for our practitioners, more for our people in our schools, I'm like, if you had that background first from that parent experience, then you are able to then move forward and go, okay, how can we implement this in the school? And then also bring the parents in.
Yeah. I make the same recommendation when teachers are saying, so where should I start? I recommend, Smart But Scattered or Smart But Scattered Teens. And the other advantage to that is, first of all, the language is much more accessible. But second of all, if you're reading Smart But Scattered as a teacher, then you're doing some thinking about, oh, what would this look like in the classroom? So you're sort of strengthening their metacognitive skills. You're not feeding it to them, but you're saying, okay, think about what this routine might look like in the classroom. Or is there a similar routine, like getting ready for school routine in Smart But Scattered? What does that look like? Getting ready to go home routine in the classroom. So yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that because I make the same recommendations.
When we did the book club earlier this year, we were reading a book that's really geared towards parents, and most of the people in the book club were school psychologists. And so we were having a lot of conversation about number one, the perspective. Like that book gives you a really great perspective of what the families are dealing with
Yeah.
in the home setting.
Yeah.
And a lot of times we're trying to figure out what are some other strategy ideas for that setting. There's lots of things we can do at school, but again, going back to COVID and being able to send all those kids back to their home would have been great in hindsight if we also sent all those kids home with some strategy ideas for the families on how
Yeah. Yeah.
to work through some of these different skills.
Yeah.
Um,
Sure.
so, yeah, we were definitely having that conversation of, wow, this is a great idea for the home setting. How could we think about that from our role, either providing direct support, which I know a lot of school psychologists are looking at emotional control when they're doing counseling and,
Right. Right.
helping to support goal development and IEPs. And so to me, that book, even though it's geared towards parents, was, like I mentioned, super helpful for, I think, anyone working with these students who struggle with these skills.
Yeah. Good.
Well, what is a key message that you would want every educator to take away regarding the importance of executive skills in supporting student success and well being?
Okay, so I'm going to read you something because I've done a lot of thinking about this. And I thought I can try to speak off the cuff, but this is my message. I think that I would particularly like school psychologists, teachers to particularly understand. I've used this as part of my presentation, but here's how it reads. In the work we've done with schools, we've had the most success in integrating executive skills into the work teachers do with kids when the focus is on helping teachers, and I got a bunch of bullet points here, helping teachers understand what executive skills are and how they impact learning and school performance, helping teachers make a connection between student behavior and specific executive skills so they know what it looks like in the classroom. And so they avoid using words like lazy or disruptive. That's one of my pet peeves. Helping teachers learn how to give this same information to students so that students understand what executive skills are and can look at their own skill set and identify strengths and challenges, and helping teachers work with students to help them recognize the obstacles that are getting in the way of using executive skills successfully and to find just the right strategies that will work for them to help them overcome those obstacles. And in conclusion, I say, we think this process looks less like a curriculum and more like a conversation, and a conversation that changes from year to year and student to student, depending on the developmental level of the child and where that child is on their own path toward executive skill mastery. Hope that sounded okay.
I love that. I love that. I have to admit, which book are you reading that from in case I'm
Um,
interested?
I don't know whether I may have included it in the latest edition of Smart But Scattered,
Okay.
but I use it in my workshops when it seems appropriate. So, but
I
yeah.
love Well, this podcast is called The Prepared School Psychologist. When you think of that term prepared, what do you do to help yourself feel more prepared in all of your many roles?
Well, again, I come back to my own executive skills profile, and one of my executive skill weaknesses is flexibility. So I prepare by imagining all the possible outcomes and coming up of any situation and coming up with a plan B in advance. When I think about it, and that's the real advantage of being in the field for a while because you build up this database of experiences. Again, for someone who's weak in flexibility, there are fewer surprises, not because it's the surprises that always I struggle with. So, and the other thing I did, and I mean, I'll just throw this out there. When one of the reasons I left the public schools was because I used to get really anxious about having to be an expert at everything. And this really hit home. And it was still several years before I left the schools, but I was working in an elementary school where one morning a third grader didn't show up at school and she'd been abducted and never seen again. And this was in a town in New Hampshire that was close enough to Boston so that Boston TV stations were coming up to film parent meetings. I mean, it was the worst thing imaginable. And I had no experience at that point in crisis intervention. And since, our adult executive skills, we talk about stress tolerance, and that's one of my weaker skills. So I was like stressed to the max. And so I decided I needed a job where I didn't have to be an expert at everything, because that was just too anxiety provoking to me. So moving into a clinic setting first where I focused on assessment, and particularly in the areas that I was most comfortable with, learning disabilities and attention disorders, and then branching out into executive skills where I could feel like, okay, this is a field I can become an expert in. And so the questions I'm going to get asked, anytime I do a parent or teacher presentation, I rarely get asked a question I haven't heard 100 times before. I mean, I'm refining my answers and learning from experience, but it's just been for me. And I think school psychologists out there, I think you can't be an expert at everything. And so decide what your niche is if you have the luxury of doing that. And if you're working in a school district where there are a lot of different school psychologists, then you can carve out your own niche and refer another school psychologist to handle the crisis intervention, because you're not very good at that, speaking for myself. Which, and interestingly enough, that school district had several school psychologists, but we were all siloed. And, I was the elementary school psychologist. There was a middle school psychologist in high school. We rarely even spoke, which is not good practice. Hopefully that doesn't happen anymore. But yeah.
I found that really interesting with my private practice, that I have families who will share with me what their concerns are, and I will very easily say, no, thank you, to certain ones, because I like to be able to focus in on the handful of areas that I want to focus in on, and how different that is, because in the school setting, there are many areas of eligibility, and you don't get to say no, thank you. That parent has that concern, or that child just had a traumatic brain injury, and you're thinking in your head, have we ever talked about TBI? That 10-minute conversation we had in grad school, I agree. There's so many different things, and all of the areas that we need to become experts in, or at least have a lot of good knowledge in, are just getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah. Yeah.
It can be very overwhelming.
Yeah. And I'm sure there's school psychologists out there, I mean, we're probably high on stress tolerance, who love that idea that, oh, what am I going to be hit with tomorrow? And that's great. But for those school psychologists who don't fall into that category, I think part of it is just sort of forgiving yourself. And I mean, I was president of NASS many, many, many years ago. And I remember thinking, oh, we all have this idea in our head of what's the perfect school psychologist. And I'm thinking, I am nowhere close to the perfect school psychologist. And it took me the longest time to realize there is no perfect school psychologist out there. And if you're holding yourself to that standard, you're going to be perennially frustrated. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast and for sharing your wealth of knowledge with all of our listeners. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. No, this was fun.
Well, for anyone looking to dive deeper into Dr. Dawson's work, be sure to check out the Smart But Scattered series. All of the resources that she shared will be linked in our show notes. Thanks again, and we will see you next time on the Prepared School Psych podcast. Thank you, everyone. That concludes another episode of the Prepared School Psych podcast. And I hope today's discussion equipped you not just with knowledge, but also the confidence to take action. Remember, every conversation we have and every resource we share builds a bridge towards a more inclusive and empowering learning landscape for our students. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more insightful conversations and resources to support your journey. Share this podcast with colleagues. We would love it if you would also rate and review the podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Just a reminder, everyone, the information and advice provided in this podcast are for guidance purposes only, and all listeners are required to follow both federal and state law and their own school district guidelines and policies. Thank you.